All right, hello and welcome to the Azure Back to School 2023 edition. On our today's session, a customer journey to the cloud starts here. Please check out the YouTube and the formal website for any information regarding the content that will be shared with you within the following month. As part of Who Am I? My name is Dimitar. I will be the host of today's session. I've been here for a while in regards to the cloud operations and the roads involving the cloud from Microsoft primarily. I used to work for Microsoft almost 11 years way back. Now I'm doing a freelance on different Microsoft technologies involving cloud migration, cloud adoption, which span between Azure and Microsoft 365. A couple of links there. Please reach out if you want to connect. I'm also part of the local Macedonia IT Pro user group for as far back as the actual start of the group. And if you need to either reach out, communicate, share ideas, or do a session for us as well, please reach out. As part of today's session, I always kick in with the must-read section, and these are the things that I actually utilize on a day-to-day operation within my regular work, which focuses on Azure mostly. So I look at the cloud adoption framework, the Azure well-architected framework, the reference architecture, the design patterns and anti-patterns. I always look at the Azure subscription limits and quotas, although that's part of the cloud adoption framework, to be fair, as well as the resource naming conventions and tagging. So I'm going to share the links at the end of the session, also share my GitHub repository where I continually update the content and any links that pop up regarding any Microsoft related material, Microsoft Learn material, or something that I find interesting. I actually put it over there. Now, this is a session that I've run a few times back, and I try to bring in, right, there is a subset of standardized slides here, but I try to bring in some things I learned during either successful or unsuccessful implementations or projects with different customers I worked now as part of my freelance work, as well as the previous X number of years operating as part of different partner, or in this case, vendor entity, right? So it all starts or boils down to what are we trying to build here, right? And whatever approach we have, we need to have some form of foundation, right? And then from that foundation, we build up. As it applies to different disciplines, it also applies for the cloud. Right? So whether we're building a simple thing as a house, if I may use the term simple, or we're building a stadium, or we'll be building a fairly small bridge, we need to have some foundation for where we will start and then build upon that and then produce whatever needs to be produced at the end of the day, right? When we're talking to the cloud and the process of building something there, the cloud adoption framework is our first to go to place there, right? And it's a vast subset of pages in Microsoft Learn, or kind of a document, if I may frame it like that. But it is a framework that gives us guidance how to move forward. Right? It will not solve our problems. It will not be a magical wand that we can just wave and then everything will be there, but it will streamline the process. And these are the main components of that process, right? We start with the definition of our strategy, right? Where we are and where we want to ultimately going to be when we finalize the process or we get to a specific milestone and then move forward. Once we define the strategy, we need to plan, then prepare or ready phase, then we move to adoption. And as part of the end-to-end process, we have the security, govern, and manage components of the cloud adoption framework. Now let's talk a little bit around the actual definition of our strategy, right? Now, this is a generic slide and content, meaning that this is the guidance that the cloud adoption framework gives us in this perspective, which means there is always a form of a business event, can be critical, but it might not be critical, which triggers the migration process. Right? So it might relate to anything regarding the on-premises environment, where due to age of the hardware and software components, reduction of the carbon and data center footprints, right? It's a merger acquisition or diversifying the portfolio of a company, right? Different entities, different motivation triggers here. might be end of support, not from a hardware, but also from a software perspective. Any major vendor or third-party ISV supplied tools and software components. It can be also related to any specific regulatory compliance, data sovereignty requirements we might have, and ultimately improve any form of IT operations we might run in the environment. Now, this spans focus, if you look at the cloud option framework, will be on enterprise entities, and it actually encompasses anything that Microsoft has learned during the process of implementation and people contributing to the framework itself. But again, at a certain scale, of course, we can always adapt and implement it in a smaller or a mid-sized type of organization. And again, small versus mid-sized versus enterprise differs from where, depending from what region we come from. And then once we figure out what the critical business events is, or just a simple business event that will trigger the motivation process to move towards the cloud environment and adopt these technologies in a certain manner, we have the migration or innovation motivations that actually support this process. It can be, and if I may frame it as simple as that, as cost savings, right? Reduction of some vendor infrastructure or operational complexities there, optimizing certain operations, but it can also be focused on specific business requirements like scaling, right? Faster go-to-market processes, introduction of interrupting technologies, components, etc., etc., right? But then again, this depends whether we're going to do migrate or we're going to do full innovation in the environment, which boils down to certain processes and capabilities inside. Now, from a technical standpoint, we're looking at scalability, availability, security and compliance, and capacity optimization. These are things that come with the Azure environment, a kind of a must-have or built-in, right? Anything that we need to build within an on-premises data center from literally scratch at a certain point, but during the time it just gets, well, not complex, but gets to a kind of a run rate process, which refers mainly to pre-reservation of resources so we can scale for future demands or we can make them more available and then implement additional security and compliance tooling or models on top of it and then continually optimize that capacity. From a technical standpoint, cloud gives us a little bit of more flexibility there. Not to go into details, but we'll spend some time on that rather than on the session itself. Now, in different scenarios, right, different customers, different languages, maybe different needs, but it all boils down to several things that I actually kind of find them repeating in pretty much every project or every interaction I have with people in different events or like online or on-site, right, where we discuss certain aspects of the cloud adoption process. One thing would be that, and I still see this, I thought after, I don't know, X number of years, this would be something that will kind of move away, right? At a certain point, well, when Azure was introduced and well, Amazon was already there was a buzzword, right? That word a few years back became the digital transformation term used, but still, I see entities, organizations, specifically on a C level, falling for the so-called buzzwords, right? So if everybody uses it, we must use it too. And this is the wrong place to start. I'm not saying or implying that a specific company is not meant to run certain services in the cloud, but it's not just, yeah, because everybody has it, we also need to have it. Right? This impacts how the process will be run. This will impact what the end result would be, and it will be misguiding or misleading in that perspective. Now, when it comes to that, I also see a lot of business to item miscommunication, and this goes both ways, right? Because we do speak the same language, but we don't speak the same language at the same time, right? So the business has a different ways of looking at things and talking about these things. We in IT have a different view. I mean, yeah, it's on the same topic probably, but different point of view on the specific things and processes and whatever it's involved from a more technical side. And I've seen this a lot. I mean, I came from a very high technical background, and during my Microsoft years, I learned how to communicate with the business. I still get surprised after Yeah, a lot of years spent on the business side as well as on the IT side. But that level of miscommunication is affecting any form of strategic approach to the cloud adoption process. Ultimately, that would also lead to lack of visibility and then actual strategy, what we want to do. Right? It is either poorly defined, which means there are gaps. And yes, the cloud adoption plan, which would be the actual output and then our guiding document during the process of cloud adoption, can be corrected, but still the misalignment due to miscommunication, buzzwords, things like that, leads to the poorly defined strategy, which generates those gaps. Again, miscommunication doesn't improve. I mean, any form of iteration or model that we use, if we all talk, but we all feel that we're the smartest person in the room, then something is wrong in the room there, right? Not to imply that you might not be the smartest person, but still it is an issue. No clear definition of any perspective goals and its specific direction, right? That's a kind of an imminent failure in the process. Now, again, people coming from a stronger IT background do struggle when they need to talk with business. I've seen a few times CIOs trying to push a project in the organization. They make the project proposals or the strategic document too technical, which actually resets the people on the other side to the default, which boils down to the last thing, right? Fear of the unknown. And yes, I know there's a lot of service you find, and the C-level is aware of the cloud, and they like the digital transformation process and the adoption, etc., etc. It is improved during the years, but there are still falling points, and this is a default human behavior, right? When we have some form of a fear, if I may frame it like that, from the unknown, we reset back to the defaults, or we go to our comfort zone, to the things we know. And I've been in several situations back in the years where, due to this fear of the unknown, I almost got, if I may frame it like that, verbally attacked on a meeting due to different reasons from technical people. And I'm talking about organizations that I spent years as trusted advisor, and then when there was a miscommunication at the table, or somebody did not understand completely what the strategy is or what we are trying to do, then there is a pushback from the other side. Technical, business, finance, whoever it is, right? The actual business owners of the application services we're looking at, whatever is there on the other side, right? So, and there are ways how we can work around this one. For example, in respect of the cloud adoption framework, I'm gonna talk a little bit when we start talking about the planning. Now, once we define the strategy, right, we understand the motivations, what are the business outcomes and justification, we then prioritize the projects, and then based on that prioritized plan, we start, prioritized list, we start planning, right? Which means we need to look at these specific projects and look what's in there. Which implies we need to do a couple of steps, preferably in order, but in some organizations, and my experience tells me that in large organizations, this tends to be done in parallel, right? It's all connected to people, time, material, where material is also connected, as I usually frame it like that, to the money allocated to run the project. So we need to look at whatever the so-called digital estate as it is defined in the cloud adoption framework, which means whatever application service I look at, it can be a monolithic application, it can be some virtualized application, it can be something that we consider it's a form of a software as a service running inside the org, but it still has some infrastructure behind it. We need to start the rationalization process, right? This will help us determine what's the best way to approach the migration, the 5 R's of the process. We also need to look at the organizational alignment. Right? Now, yeah, as time progresses, there is not only a single cloud, we have organizations that run multi-cloud strategies, but what I noticed, especially during the COVID years, people just moved to the cloud. They were not doing the process right. They were not doing proper planning. There were different reasons why we accelerated the digital transformation. And I've seen within the past, after COVID years, right, let's say almost 2 years back, maybe less, I see people struggling with whatever it's on the other side. Now we have to go back to the square one and look at whatever planning was done. And trust me, there is a lot of organizations that have almost zero planning run there. And then try to figure out what happened, what's wrong, and things like that. So we have multi unhappy parties in the equation, right? So the partners are struggling because somebody asked them to kind of fast track the process. The organization using the cloud service is struggling because there was no proper planning, there was no proper rationalization, there was no kind of planned or kind of detailed organizational alignment. Skills readiness was sketchy, and then cloud option plan was not there, ultimately. And I'm gonna kind of circle back on some of these topics, right? Now, as far as the rationalization process goes, right? There's the traditional versus the incremental rationalization process, which, let's say, when we fast track it, it's neither, right? And this is one of the, well, cannot frame it as failure points, but especially if somebody already moved there and then there's gaps, but it is a problem that will influence any operational process run in the organization. So the process of evaluation, whatever digital assets, right? And this is referred to any application service I look at, and then all of its corresponding components. We need to do a thorough inventory. And there is two ways how we can do. We can do quantitative or qualitative analysis, right? The inventory implies that we need to look at every asset and analyze what its hardware, software, and other adjacent services components are there, right? Whether it's a multi-service component that has multiple software and hardware components inside, different application services running as part of the actual asset. Operating system wise, any system performance metrics we can collect, so we can actually figure out what's going on, how the systems and services are interconnected, and how that will actually ultimately get into the cloud. Now, from the quantitative analysis, so the cloud option framework works in a way it gives you a guidance, but this is a form of a question answer process where we can ultimately even decide whether this specific asset should exist anymore in the organization or not. Right? Now, the quality analysis, it is more tailored to the actual solution we are looking at. And then anybody specifically working with that business solution can give us the quality information, which in some cases can be tough, especially if some of the business stakeholders or the that actually were part of the original system and there is no proper documentation actually left the company, which means there will be gaps. But then again, the power user side, which means people actively using it, could provide us some insights. Now, for a larger organization, the business and stakeholders and power users, it's might be easier to find maybe, or depending on the size of the organization, they might be spread around different geographies. So nothing is easy. But in a smaller organization, this probably will fall on shoulders on a few people that had it, that carry too many hats here. Now, the kind of traditional model takes time. Now, Microsoft assesses that on a per asset, to do a quality analysis, we would need between 40 and 80 full-time employee hours per asset. Now imagine that the organization has 100 assets that they need to look at, right? Now, yes, the larger and the more complex are, they will need a little bit more time. But then again, by supporting frameworks like Cloud Option Framework, Well-Located Framework, other resources, yes, we can kind of streamline it, find the most possible or acceptable architecture for them. But still, somebody needs to look at that actual asset and determine what's going on. And we, if we're not part of the organization or outsourced, then we cannot ultimately run that decision. I mean, from an IT perspective, we cannot do it. We need to consult the business stakeholders and power users and guide them properly. So we run the so-called incremental rationalization process. The idea here is to reduce the data discovery points, make the decisions more streamlined, and then base them on some temporary assumptions. Now, there is a positive force feedback on that one, because any assumptions we make during the rationalization phase, it can be challenged. which means, yes, as told you, you can either retire the asset or look at some form of parallel transformation efforts. Now, this will help us assess what the first workloads would be based on business, technical criteria, quality of analysis, and ultimately cost model alignment. Those workloads will be the ones undergoing the decision what type of migration direction we'll look at. Now, Microsoft recommends to select the top 10. If you are doing it for the first time, go for 1, 2, maybe 3. But even if you do a little bit more, don't go more than 5, and I'll circle back to that one a little bit when I kind of talk about the findings. Right. So these are the 4 R's, although they are 5, which means replace it. So we can do rehost, refactor, re-architecting, or rebuilding, or creating a new. And then the 5th one would be replace it with some software as a service component, right? So moving to, I don't know, Dynamics 365 for our CRM solution, or something else that's part of the software as a service portfolio that can be integrated with Azure, right? So rehosting, it's I like the move and improve used a few years back by a fellow MVP, but the official term that Microsoft uses is lift and shift, which has pros and cons always. It's the shortest path to the cloud, but then can come with all potential problems or issues we have with that specific system. So on premises, we just move them to another environment. Refactoring implies that we're not focusing on infrastructure, but we actually move some workloads as platform services. So, for example, web applications are kind of a very usual suspect in this scenario, right? I might do some tweaking on the application side, but I can, depending on the runtime environment it has, so we can just kind of move it to a PaaS environment, okay? Avoid some issues and then use the benefits of the PaaS services. We can do re-architecting, which implies that the application actually does not understand, due to different legacy capabilities that it already has, doesn't understand the cloud, so might need to do some re-architecture and then port it to the environment. And then fourth step or option would be do a full rebuild or create everything from scratch and create a kind of a cloud aware application service. And then ultimately the 5th option would be to replace it with some software as a service environment. And again, these decisions are part of our planning, are part of our rationalization process, and then they're part of our cloud adoption plan. Now, what I have figured out, right? Inventory process takes time, right? And it's a fast-paced world we're living and working with, but then again, we cannot rush perfection, right? Rationalization process will be the key to success. If you can avoid rehosting, go for it. And always remember, you're moving from on-premises, which I consider a static environment, to a distributed asynchronous environment like Azure. That comes with capabilities, but also comes with caveats on the other side, right? So from a design architecture operational mind perspective, things will change. We will have to get out of our comfort zone, right? Anything we run on the on-premises, it is, as I always say, and compared to anything running in the cloud, it's static environment, right? So there is no kind of one to rule all model here, or kind of a silver bullet type of thing I can tell you on this. This is something that happens, and these are the things that actually impact the actual process here, right? And yes, I mentioned earlier that the incremental rationalization is cutting corners, right? That helps the inventory kind of go smoother and faster. But then again, we can always circle back and kind of reframe, right? The catch would be here that once we do it once, we can actually repeat it many times and then learn from our mistakes or draw our best practices on the other side. Organizational alignment is also a very important thing, and this will impact how we do our operations or how do we amend our existing operations. Let me phrase it like that. And then enhance or embed the cloud side here. Now, no matter how big the team is, I always circle back to the RACI matrix, right? Responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Now, yeah, in a smaller team, maybe we can keep in line easier than in a larger organization, but have in mind that my experience with smaller teams is that they get overwhelmed after a while. I worked on a couple of projects where I had to deal with the same 3 people due to the size of the organization. That was it, right? So organizational alignment model is also important in this case, right? So for a large organization where there are people handling this from a business and also from a HR administrative perspective, this would work. But we usually start with a small cloud adoption team, and then we have the cloud governance team on the other side. I've seen a few times where this misalignment caused issues almost towards the end of the project. So one hand, so there are 3 models that can be used. Organizational chart alignment, virtual teams, and then use a mixed model, right? Where we have the organizational chart, so we create a completely new adapted structure. And by this, I don't mean slapping digital transformation something or cloud something in the business card of the person. That's buzzwording, right? Doesn't explain a lot. So I've seen also samples like that. They rebrand every employee containing a buzzword of some kind. I mean, it's nice from a corporate communication perspective, maybe, but in real life, I still haven't found the value of that. You will need a business card for your business card so you can have your title on the other side. So it is a methodology that needs to be looked at. And again, there are organizations that rely on virtual teams for several reasons, because, and I see it kind of a go-to model because it's a large enough organization. They have different experts residing in different regions, or they have a structure that actually implies that that specific cloud adoption team initially that was assigned and then expanded until we get to the circle of excellence, for example, cloud circle of excellence in this case. And then we have the governance side on the other side. So again, there is a baseline. Even if we start small, because we're talking about a couple of workloads, a couple of assets that need to be moved, right? And especially if we do it for the first time, right? Start small and then expand. The catch would be here that we need to design and architect the environment to sustain large number of services running there, depending on the size of the organization, of course. Now, from an organizational alignment perspective, right? The cloud adoption process will create, and will continue to create disruption. It's on the services, but also on the people side, right? So we need to manage this as part of the whole process. Always remember that whatever we do, we need to minimize the disruption to your business or your customer's business, right? So whenever we look at specific assets, we start with choosing the assets that have minimum business impact on the environment. Because maybe we might be proficient what we're doing, or if we're part of the IT organization in that environment, we know what needs to be done. But we also need to assume that the other side needs to be prepped and ready to do this as well. Right. Do spend some time on the RACI matrix. I've seen few scenarios where assigning too much responsibility to a small team is not a good thing. Remember, they do have their daily tasks they need to perform. So me being as a kind of an external factor in quite a few environments, yes, I can always ask the weird or the uncomfortable questions. I never, because I'm not part of the organization, I tend to ask more to understand better what's going on, which means I can stir discussions or give them some ideas or find what they missed, identify the gaps there. Which also boils down to we need to determine whether we need somebody to support us during the process and for how long. Right. Again, organizational alignment thing. It's one thing if I need to align the employees or members of the team on a global scale. It's a different if I have external people in the team, right? But assigning, for example, coming from my perspective, yes, when I'm engaged in the project, I can spend 8 to 10 hours talking about the topic. But I never expect that the people in the organization to whom I am part and I support them in the process can't work more than 4 hours on that topic only. So I can do rationalization and inventory and things like that all day, but I can't expect that the people running day-to-day operations can spend more than 4 hours on that topic with me. Now imagine that with multiple people, or imagine that with running parallel projects, right? It's a problem. So, and that will cause cracks inside. Now, from an organizational skills perspective, yeah, that's the learning curve, right? Mapping the tools and everything, kind of thing. But what I've learned from a training perspective, whether you use the Microsoft Learn as an environment, whether you use any other learning platform, including Microsoft Visual Training in a training provider, right? I always enclose in the cloud option plan what needs to be done as a training. Not only for technical people, but also for the business people, the power users, the stakeholders, whoever is involved in the asset inventory, or I need to get some information, they need to go through the training, right? Whatever part of the IT operation teams, networking, security, governance, models, things like that, but also on the business side. I tend to categorize them and insist that they go for the mandatory. It's nice if they have recommended, and then the optionals are just if somebody needs to learn something more and get some more information. Now, I have also learned that, yeah, I do insist to finish the trainings and I recommend it, but there is a catch-22. I see a lot of scenarios where due to time constraints and rushing things and things that happened as an accelerated digital transformation process, nobody went through the training. So the systems are as is, and then we train the people, and then we need to figure out how to fix issues. But then again, it also boils down to another problem when we design and talk about the architecture and the ways how we can actually move forward and migrate or innovate or whatever it's part of our cloud adoption strategy. They go back to the default. The fear of the unknown kicks, as I mentioned it a few slides back, right? I mean, I have a lot of examples like this. And I can talk hours of a specific situation and things like that, and not to name anybody in the environment, but yeah, I've seen this a lot as a problem. Because especially if you're a small organization or mid-sized organization where a lot of operations rely on the same people and they wear multiple hats there, that would be even bigger problem, unfortunately. Now, if you are already established as a trusted advisor, which means whatever you suggest, they would go for it, right? It is nice, feels nice, but I don't like that. I mean, I'm honored that when they consider me as a trusted advisor. I've been quite a few times in a situation like that, and I'm still am on a certain several projects. But I like the two-way understanding model here. Probably that's something that I like, but hopefully you would like it as well. Right, so when we talk about the design or architecture and I tend to suggest you something, then I want to push back on the other side. Right? This is the whole point of discussion and doing a whiteboarding sessions. I like those, by the way, and discussing different aspects, right? It is things that need to be understood, but also we'll learn from each other in that process. It's not only just clicking through the trainings, right? The trainings will help me when I throw in the acronyms and the technical lingo and things like that, and they will understand me, right? But then, as they understand what I'm talking about or you're talking about, they will also have questions from their side. Some things that I don't see them at that point, I tend to read all the documentation they provide me and spend a couple of days just on reading on different procedures, frameworks, whatever they have, architecture, design documents, even performance reports, whatever they do, if they did some analysis on the environments, whatever I can get my hands on, I try to read it because I need to figure out what's going on there. Otherwise, me helping would be a kind of, for me at least, there will be gaps. Right? So even before starting the actual plan phase and moving forward to ready, I don't like going to the ready phase if the mandatory trainings are not done, right? And again, I still kind of get on the catch-22 here. Now, the whole process of the cloud adoption plan is, right, defining the prerequisites. And there is a template in the cloud adoption framework, and it's in the links I'll share. Then define and prioritize the workloads. Microsoft recommends the power of 10 model, but I would go for the power of 3, right? Never go for the high business impact, because that's a different ball game, especially if you're not that proficient in the process, or whoever member of the cloud adoption and cloud governance teams are. In this case, are not very proficient in what's going on. Maybe they're doing in parallel trainings. So these efforts needs to be taken in consideration. So the more we add, the more complex might get, and then we'll have issues. Align the assets, right? Identifying which assets, whether they're proposed or existing, are required to support these 3 workloads you have selected. Again, review the rationalization decision, and then define whether you're going to migrate or innovate. So define on the 5 R's actually at the end of the day. You define the iterations and releases, and then do the estimation of the timeline. The estimation of the timeline goes hand in hand. It's a rough timeline. It's not a kind of a firm, detailed project plan, but it helps you assess the resources that need to be put as part of that specific plan involving the prioritized projects. Now, what do we have learned? Do create the cloud adoption plan and use it. I always tell this, my first cloud adoption plan was 7 pages long. I thought that was quite enough, but then I realized it's not. And again, remember, it can be revised. It's not written in stone, right? So you can revise it and update it, right, as things change, as things progress, but don't overdo it, right? Too many going back and forth. Again, if you're new or beginning in this journey and process, especially if the other side is as well, then you'll need to do a bit of more iterations, but still, when you get the hang of it, it's easy, right? Well, easy. The estimated timeline inside is just for reference point. Right, so I've seen scenarios where business and finance specialists supported on that side take it as a granted and say, okay, 3 weeks, nice, we're going to do it in 3 weeks. Right. So whenever I do an estimate, I do it as a kind of we start on Monday and then we run 8 hours per day, for example, and then we work. And I remember, nobody can spend more than 4 hours working with you on that project. I mean, even if you're part of the organization, I don't see that feasible. We do have daily tasks and daily responsibilities. And then when we move from IT operations towards the business side, they do have their own processing task, which means we need to accommodate. And then the larger the organization is, a lot of horizontal communication, right? It just helps size the process, right? People, time, cost, and do some estimation. It will help us with the business case and get the appropriate corporate sponsorship in that case, right? You don't need to do a detailed work down. Nobody will look at it. If you try to do that at this phase, you'll generate an issue, right? Because the people, time, cost thing will get a little bit complex. I mean, with all the details, something will be missing. Somebody from the project office will pick it up, then finance will pick it up, and then it will just go messy. I mean, I'm not saying don't do it as part of the environment, but still be careful with that, right? Getting into too much details at this phase doesn't work. Right? You need to fast track the process of approval and then ultimately run the project. Now, once we have done there, we go to the ready phase, which means operating model. We start building up our landing zone, design and concepts, and then we look at different implementation options. Now, the landing zones, rather confusing term that can be seen, and it is a kind of a construct, right? Like that gives us a proper structure when we do the cloud adoption and start moving the environment from on-premises to the cloud or integrated in a hybrid model. So there are a couple of design areas we need to look at, right? We need to figure out, do I need a single or multiple subscriptions? Depending on the size of organization, we look at the enterprise enrollment, for example, or we look for different ways how we can actually procure through the, for example, cloud solution provider program. We need to look at how do we handle the identity? How do we structure the resources in the organization so we can enable the governance, risk, compliance, and security models? We need to look at the network topology and connectivity. Now, you can look at top down, bottom up, something like that, no problem, but we need these 4 areas to be looked at initially. We have the governance disciplines, we have the deployment options, the operational baselines, and business continuity and disaster recovery. Now, all this initial side, the subscription, identity, resource organization, network topology, would be part of our baseline. And then as we move towards governance, deployment, operations, right, business continuity, disaster recovery, we can start small and then expand, or again, any form of baseline there would be helpful, depending on what workloads we have selected, what's the ultimate goal for the organization, and what's the minimum that needs to be established inside. As far as the landing zone goes, you can always look to the cloud option framework. It will give you different diagrams and everything, but this is kind of a best bundle of information I can assign to the construct of landing zone, right? Now, landing zone can have multiple components, and these components are based on what your landing zone design would be, right? It will belong to a specific subscription, right? It will contain inside different assets, right? It can be a single or multiple applications that are part maybe of that specific asset. And within that application, we do have specific resources. Is it the virtual machine? Is it a platform service, right? Is it a database service? Is it just storage? Now, from a kind of on top of it, we give it a specific construct, right? Which means we need to handle the identity and access management and monitoring, apply specific policies. And then on the infrastructure side, we need to look at the networking as well as some form of shared services that will be needed, right? Which means these are the governance risk compliance components on top of the landing zone. So who has what kind of access and what they can do? Are there any specific policies we run against that specific landing zone? So we determine what's allowed, what's not allowed as part of the resources that can be deployed and whatever configuration we find as our baseline. We look at management and monitoring, right? How do we collect and aggregate data that will give us not only performance and operational knowledge, but also security data? And then how do we connect, interconnect, communicate, and whether we're looking about a pure cloud solution with a kind of a form of a cross-connected networks? Do we have some centralized access point in means of shared services where we get in, get out of the environment through the internet, through any form of a closed loop circuits, and how do we interact with other shared services, not only related to network, right? The identity management side. Now, from a kind of overlapping side, so we have the cost management, Azure Monitor, Network Watcher, and the Security Center or the Defender for Cloud environment. However, we structure our landing zone, right? We need to look at all these components, right? What's the billing and how do we handle the identity and access management, network topology and connectivity, resource organization, governance management, security, and then what's the level of automation? If we check all the boxes, then we can actually deploy the conceptual landing zone architecture, kind of a, not one to rule them all, but all at once. But we can also go gradually, right? It is our foundation that we need to look at. What are our baselines and where do we start initially? And then check a couple of boxes, do a small implementation, iterate, check, right? Configure, reconfigure, go back, do some things. And then until we get to the ultimate environment and configuration, which will be checking all the boxes, and then we run operations at the end. Now, as far as the adoption size, so we have defined what our operational model would be. We designed and architected our landing zone environment. So we decide whether we do migrate, modernize, or do we do innovate, right? So it's kind of a high level thing. If we do a migrate, we need to do assess of those workloads. We need to deploy them and then release them to production. In regards to modernization, we need to define specific business goals and then create our modernization roadmap. And there are two options, right? Do we look at process modernization, error optimization, or application and database modernization optimization? And then when you go to innovate, which is part of the overall digital innovation process, right? We need to start from creating a specific hypothesis with specific business value attached to it, and then we get the proper consensus from the whole business stakeholders in the environment, and then we build our first minimum viable product. We do measurement, we learn from the findings, and then we move. And these are the specific scenarios that it's related as part of the innovation adoption process. Now, on the secure, govern, and manage side, this is something that will span across all stages, right? From planning, ready, and then adopt, and then it will kind of loop continuously. If you look at the security side, and these are the in each setup, we have the business alignment, we have the specific security or manage or govern disciplines, and then we have the appropriate teams assigned to it, right? For the business side, we usually establish a form of a cross-organization processes that will scale to the cloud security model based on how the level of integration is done and how it is related to the specific business, right? As far as the security disciplines goes, these are the access control, security operations, asset protection, security governance, and innovation in security. Who will handle this? Initially might be the governance team supported with some security operations or people assigned to security operations. But then as we expand, we'll probably get to cloud center of excellence, larger cloud operations, IT operations teams, governance teams, security teams, etc. Right? And again, if it's a larger organization, we might have these exist. In a smaller organization, this tends to be spread, or maybe additional resources need to be assigned at a certain point in time. Right? As far as the technology stack, I'm just gonna throw this here. You might be familiar already, but these are the components that are actually attached and kind of overlap in different areas, right? From access control, asset protection, security governance, right? Different Azure components and services that can be used that will support this specific process with the native tools. And again, you can always bring your own tool sets. On the governance side, again, from a business perspective, right, we look at whatever business risk, we document them. The business will define what's the tolerance for that risk, which is related to data classification and application criticality, right? What's the criticality of the application? Then we look at the policies and compliance, right? Which is a boundary, the operational boundary, and then establishing a process to monitor any form of violation and implement future improvements, right? As far as the disciplines involved here would be cost management, security baseline, resource consistency, identity baseline, and deployment acceleration. And again, we can spend a day on each talking about different aspects and things that are part of the government knowledge. On the managed side, again, on the business alignment side, we look at the criticality, right? What's the criticality and what's the relative business value of the specific workload, right? That needs to go to the cloud. What would be the impact, right, in regards to time and value if something happens to that workload? That's why initially we start with low business impact project, so we can define and create this governance, security, and manage process and establish the baseline. But then we need to enhance it as time goes, right? And then commitment side would be documentation, tracking, reporting for cost and performance, right? Which means the 5 disciplines here would be inventory and visibility, operational compliance, protect and recover, platform operations, and workload operations. Now, if we look at from a baseline process, right? We start with establishing a form of a baseline. It's a kind of a go-to thing in any segment we're talking here, right? We establish what's our minimum requirement based on organizational policies, governance models, or whatever, for inventory and visibility, operation compliance, and protection and recovery. Right? From a cloud operation perspective, we look at the business alignment in that case, right? Criticality, impact, commitment. For that specific baseline, we're going to run, right? So we we can start from zero to hero model, but it will take some time. But given the capabilities of the cloud, we can determine always what's the minimum baseline. Something that will accompany the established management policies or processes which are approved by the business. We amend them with the cloud side, and then the enhancement, and then move forward. Then the next step would be actually advanced operation or enhancing whatever we have established there, right? So as we add additional services or improve the further down the line the management, we kind of upgrade the management baseline, we expand it as we add new services, new components, and again we maintain visibility and control from the business side. And last but not least would be performing specific platform or workload specialization, which falls under the so-called advanced operations and design principles, right? So once we move there, we start with the baseline, then we enhance it, we utilize additional capabilities of the platform we have chosen, of the environment, cloud we have chosen, and then we move towards specific either platform specialization or workload specialization, which boils down to depending whether we're running infrastructure, platform, or software as a services component. Is it a mix, or we look at more from a workload specialization, right? Based on whatever asset we have analyzed, whether workload components are there. So we do a management baseline on that mix of components inside. As far as the lessons learned, right, what we can draw here. When in doubt, always go for the baseline. And then again, actionable best practices can be found in the well-architected framework security, Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, used to be called Azure Security Benchmark, and never forget the learning curve, right? Education, education, education. There is always change, there is constant change, things get upgraded, services get improved, things get found from a security governed managed perspective, right? So we need to keep an eye on the environment. But once we establish the baseline, we have a more than a good starting point, whether we're talking about security, governance, or management process. Spend some time working on the common operating model, right? Do you use decentralized, centralized, enterprise, distributed operations, things like that? Because that will impact how things are run, right? Yeah, you can set up the secure government managed baseline, but if the operating model doesn't go through it, then we have a problem, right? I've seen too many times the common irresponsibility or responsibility actually does not exist. It all boils down to the RACI matrix, right? I've seen projects failing because of poorly designed RACI matrix, accelerated digital transformation, and then 3 days before we submit the final, we close the project, the governance teams and security teams suddenly woke up. And we were working based on documentation provided and adopted by those teams. That was the initial documents I requested. They actually provided to me the documents and the system. So it's a kind of a, we had to extend the project for 3 months because of that. Again, it was a failure point at a certain time because it turned out that the security and governance teams were not aware what was written actually in the documents. That was the biggest issue I actually realized when I ran the project. Now, I mean, yeah, we can talk about a lot. I have a lot of samples. It's just a kind of a thing that I emphasize always in the session. So make sure that you understand the business priorities and the motivations, especially if you're coming from an IT background. We might speak the same language, but we actually don't. Validate the desired cloud operational model, right? Whatever we have chosen as a process, until we release it to production, we can always circle back, right? Ultimately, at a certain point in time, we can change certain things in the operational model just by enhancing or modifying, because it is something that's constantly changing. Define the baseline for governance, security, and compliance. This is our starting point. Yes, there are recommendations. You'll find the frameworks there. and guidance and cybersecurity reference architecture, some other documents. So yeah, it will give you the knowledge. But then again, we're looking at the specific scenario of the customer environment. Remember, a lot of the documentation is enterprise ready. You might not be working for an enterprise customer. You need to also adapt there. But the baseline exists and it must exist in the environment. Support skilling and organizational alignment requirements. It is very important. I always tell this example, which is one of my kind of lighthouse examples in this area. So not talking about skilling, about organizational alignment. I was doing a lot of architecture trainings for a large entity that did a massive cloud adoption process, which was supported by a large enterprise partner. Microsoft was there. They did a lot of parallel things and important things. And after a while, I was running a year and a half within the project, different trainings and workshops and kind of boot camps for architecture design on Azure. And I always do a survey with the group. So at a certain point, I realized that whatever training they went, there was nobody from networking. And we were talking about 100 and something assets that needed to be migrated in 5, actually 6 environments, right? And there was a hybrid connectivity. And I asked one of the architects, and he actually told me that that was an outsourcing company that handled all the network. And then I asked, so are they part of the planning? Are they part of the security governance? He actually needed to check because he was doing more application side. And then we realized that nobody called them on any of the meetings, which is kind of funny because the project was running for almost 2 years there. So there was organizational alignment internally, but somebody forgot the networking stack people, right, and operations. Explore different environment design areas. Right, you'll find a lot of in the architectures, you'll find samples of the landing zones, you'll find templates, maybe you'll provide those, but once you're in the planning phase and you try to figure out what's going on, do some experimentation. Yeah, sometimes time doesn't allow it, but it is your conceptual architecture of the environment. Once you run the POC, proof of concept, you will figure out what's what and maybe circle back if it's necessary. The minimum basic governance foundation for low risk assets. That will be your learning curve process, especially if you're not proficient or the teams, the people involved as part of the team are not proficient. So you will be able, so they will be able to identify what's what. This is avoiding falling to going back to the defaults, the comfort zone. Deploy the workloads manually, automatically, whatever, right? So automation in certain areas is something that we strive for, or certain situations, but in some cases, you might need to start with manual. No worries about that. The automation will come to you, right? Different tools, different capabilities, different models you can use. Rinse and repeat, right? Whatever you have learned in the one iteration, just move it forward and enhance it further. So these are a couple of useful links, although the GitHub repository shared at the end contains pretty much everything that's listed above and some additional resources constantly updated, but these are the go-to documents, and yes, it will take you some time if you haven't seen them already. So it's easy back school, a kind of a default here, and there's a couple of letters at the end changing, but still, yeah, you can easily get to the links or just go for the GitHub repository. With that, I would like to thank you for attending this virtual session. Hope you find it very valuable. Thanks for the organizational team for having me and enabling me to be part of the Azure Back to School. Check out the YouTube as well as the website for any further future sessions as well as the recording of the existing ones. Thanks again and hope to see you in some other event.